It's been almost a year and a half since I uploaded my build along for my longbow. Since then, I've made a few changes both to the bow itself and how I shoot. Remember, this wasn't just my first attempt at making a bow, it was really my first exposure into traditional archery, having shot only compound bows in the past. One of the changes I made since the last video was cutting a shelf into the bow. With that initial bare weather rest stuck onto the unaltered riser, I had a terribly hard time getting arrows to tune well out of the bow. I could use arrow setups that were supposed to be either too stiff or too weak and still have the same result, which was knocks kicking out off the side of the bow and the rubber rest wearing out in just a couple of weeks. So I cut the shelf into about 1/8 to 3/16 inch out from center cut. Finally, I was able to get an arrow setup which stayed on a vertical path when shot with a bare shaft. I also put on a feather rest onto the shelf to make shooting more forgiving. I used wild turkey feathers from a bird I shot this spring, but basically modeled mine after the trap feather rests that you can buy from Three Rivers Archery. I did take this bow hunting last fall, but never had anything within close enough range. After shooting 3 deer with my compound during a metro hunt, I took the longbow back out during the firearm season to try and fill a tag. As I was biking back to the vehicle after opening day, I lost control of my hold on the bow and the limb got caught in the chain, putting a big gouge in it. I had to reduce wood in the surrounding area to level it at the deepest part of the gouge, and had to do the same on the other limb for balance. While I was at it, I narrowed the last 10 inches or so of the limb so that the tips were about 0.4 inches wide. This reduced my draw weight from 64 pounds to about 59 or 60, which is what it's currently at. When I first started shooting, I tried emulating famous archers like Howard Hill and Fred Bear, who both released almost immediately after coming to full draw. As I researched deeper into the world of traditional archery, I studied everyone from YouTube guys like Jimmy Blackman and Jeff Kavanaugh, to trick shooters like Byron Ferguson, to target archers and coaches like Rick Welch and Arnie Moe. What I discovered was that many modern archers come to full draw and execute a slow, controlled release, rather than releasing immediately like either Fred Bear or Howard Hill. Holding full draw and executing a clean release from there really helped my consistency, but it also exposed just how overbowed I still am. I believe shooting a 45 or 50 pound bow would help tighten my groups up quite a bit. For reference, I can shoot my compound bow at 70 pounds all day. There's just a huge difference between holding 60 pounds of full draw and 14 pounds, which is what the compound with 80% let-off equates to. I started off with a cheap leather glove for shooting, and I kept running into issues, especially when shooting split finger, of my arrows porpoising because the pointer finger was putting too much downward pressure on the nock and inducing flex during the release. I switched to a cordovan leather tab from E.W. Bateman. It's a no-pinch tab designed for split finger, but I still use it now even with the fixed crawl. I found that the cordovan leather tab allows me to get a much cleaner and more consistent release than when I use the glove. Another thing I've noticed is that if I have a poor shot with a compound, I might be off by 2 or 3 inches at 30 yards. But if I have a poor shot at 30 yards with the longbow, I might be off by a foot. It's really much less forgiving to shoot. A couple of things I've noticed in general shooting the longbow versus my compound. One, it's much lighter, which makes it easier to carry. However, if I'm walking through heavy grass or foliage, grass will get caught in between the limb and string much easier. The longbow is generally quieter than the compound, and if anything, the sound it makes is a much different pitch. It did get a little bit louder when I started shooting fixed crawl, but the accuracy boost was worth the trade-off. Shooting from hunting positions like a tree stand or a blind is much harder with the longbow. It really forces you to double check your setup to ensure that your limb and string won't contact your leg or an overhead branch. Now when I first started shooting, I was shooting split finger release. And I would have one finger above and 2 fingers below that arrow. And I would come back and I would draw with the first finger right in the corner of my mouth. And when you draw like that, you have a low anchor and you have split finger, it makes your point on distance very far. That means that if I'm shooting at 20 yards, I'm looking at a spot on the target, but the tip of my arrow is essentially in the dirt. It's not even close to where I'm trying to hit. I couldn't really use it as a gap shooting point. I couldn't really use it for split vision. It was almost entirely instinctive shooting, and as a result of that, I would get inconsistent results just because I hadn't had the repetitions over the years to really make that a consistent shooting style for me. So, in an effort to bring that point up closer to where I'm trying to hit, I tried moving my anchor point up higher, and I tried a lot of different things, tried them for several weeks at a time, and basically what I kept coming back to was I needed to have this groove of my hand fitting right along my jaw. It's a really solid point. I can hit this every time. And when I take my hand like that, and I cup it right along the back side of my jaw, my fingers just naturally come in this spot, and I have the first finger right about where the corner of my mouth is. So since this is considered a low anchor, you see some guys will have their middle finger at the corner of their mouth. Some guys will be anchored up even higher. The higher you can get that anchor point, the closer your point on distance is going to be, and that makes split vision shooting easier. It makes gap shooting easier because your gaps are smaller. But I just couldn't do it, so I had to stick with that lower anchor. And apart from getting longer arrows, which would help, I started shooting a fixed crawl, which basically means I took a third anchor point, third knocking point, so I have two holding the arrow. Now I basically come down to here, and drawing further down the string, that gets my arrow point closer to the target where I'm trying to aim. The other thing this allows me to do is I took my fletchings. I used to always put the back of my fletchings about right here, but by trimming these feathers further back, I'm able to now have the tip of my nose touch right on the back end of this shield cut fletching. Here you can see at anchor I have the web of my hand locked into the jawbone, first finger at the corner of my mouth, nose on the back of the fletch, and side of the nose against the arrow shaft. After I shoot, I come to a second anchor with my finger resting against my neck. That's a tip I picked up from one of Jeff Cavanaugh's videos. I am working on another bow right now. It's going to be a tri-lam, more of a hybrid design, 58 inches tip to tip. That'll make it much easier to maneuver from either a tree stand or a ground blind. And because of the aggressive reflex deflex, it should still be somewhat forgiving to shoot with a longer brace height and a milder string angle compared to what you'd expect from such a short bow.